On the 3rd of June, 1861, a man named Hiram Sibley signed a federal contract in Washington that most people in the room believed was a death sentence for his fortune. The terms were simple: build a telegraph line from Omaha, Nebraska to Salt Lake City, Utah, and connect it to a second line running east from Sacramento, California. 2,000 miles of copper wire, strung across a continent that had no roads, no rail lines, and almost no trees for 1,000 miles in the middle. He had 4 months. Not 4 years, 4 months. 500 men would attempt what Abraham Lincoln himself had predicted was impossible. And the reason for the deadline was the worst reason imaginable. The nation was tearing itself apart. Fort Sumter had fallen 7 weeks earlier. The Confederacy was forming its own government, and the Union had no way to speak to the Western states in less than 3 weeks. California, Oregon, the territories of Nevada and Utah, all of them were drifting, unreachable, unable to hear Washington, and unable to answer back. If the West could not hear the East, it might not stay in the Union at all. Sibley understood this. He also understood that the contract paid only $40,000 a year in federal subsidy, a fraction of what the project would actually cost. He put up most of the capital himself. He was 60 years old, a former sheriff from Rochester, New York, who had spent the last decade buying up small telegraph companies and stitching them together into what he called Western Union. He had no engineering degree. He had no construction experience. What he had was an iron conviction that electricity could hold a nation together when armies could not. And he had 2 men, one in the East, one in the West. 2 superintendents who would drive their crews toward each other across 2,000 miles of open ground, racing against winter, against the war, and against the limits of what the human body could endure. The man Sibley sent west from Omaha was Edward Creighton. If you know the name, it is probably because of the university in Omaha that bears it, Creighton University. But before the university, before the endowment, before the legacy, there was the man himself. Creighton was born in Ohio in 1820, the son of Irish immigrants. He had worked as a freight hauler, a road builder, and a telegraph line installer across Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri. By 1860, he had already surveyed the entire route from Omaha to Salt Lake City, on horseback, alone, in the dead of winter. He rode through blizzards. He slept on frozen ground. He measured distances, noted water sources, and identified the rare stands of timber that might supply telegraph poles across hundreds of miles of grassland. When he returned to Omaha in the spring of '61, he knew the route better than any living man. He knew where the Platte River could be forded. He knew where the alkali flats would kill horses. He knew where the Sioux would likely resist. And he knew, with cold precision, that the job could be done if the crews moved fast enough and if no one stopped to rest. The man running the Western crew was James Gamble. Gamble was a Californian by adoption, born in Ireland in 1826, a telegraph builder who had spent nearly a decade stringing wire through the mountains and valleys of the Pacific coast. He was methodical where Creighton was relentless. He kept detailed records. He wrote in his journal about every mile of line, every obstacle, every negotiation with local contractors for timber. His crew would work eastward from Sacramento, hauling wire and glass insulators that had been manufactured in New York, shipped by sea around Cape Horn to San Francisco, and then loaded onto ox wagons for the long climb over the Sierra Nevada. The supply chain alone was absurd. The insulators were fragile. The wire was heavy. The wagons were overloaded. Gamble wrote that the journey, he estimated at 12 days, took nearly a month. But before either crew could set a single pole, they had to solve a problem that sounds simple until you think about it. Where do you find 25,000 wooden poles in a land that has almost no trees? The Great Plains, from western Nebraska to the foothills of the Rockies, are grassland. In 1861, that grassland stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles. There were no lumber yards. There were no sawmills. There were scattered cottonwood groves along creek bottoms, and that was it. Every pole had to be cut somewhere else, loaded onto a wagon, hauled to the route, and dropped at intervals of roughly 75 yards. The eastern crew needed poles across Nebraska and into Wyoming. The western crew needed them across Nevada and into Utah. And the middle section, through the mountains and canyons of Utah, required a different solution entirely. This is where Brigham Young enters the story. Young was the leader of the Mormon settlement at Salt Lake City, and Edward Creighton traveled to meet him in person during the survey of 1860. The negotiation was practical. Young controlled the labor and the timber in Utah Territory. Echo Canyon and Weber Canyon held stands of pine and fir that could supply poles for hundreds of miles of line. Creighton needed those poles, and he needed the men to cut and set them. Young needed something too. He needed a connection to the outside world. The Mormons had been isolated in the desert for 14 years, and the Telegraph represented a lifeline, a way to communicate with Washington without waiting weeks for a letter to arrive by stagecoach. The deal was struck. Mormon contractors would supply the poles through Utah. Mormon laborers would dig the holes and set them. In return, Young's community would gain access to the Telegraph. Young assigned the contract to local men who knew the mountains, men like his own son, John W. Young, and Hamilton Gray Park, his business manager. The poles would come from Echo Canyon and Weber Canyon, cut from stands of pine that grew on slopes so steep that mules had to drag the timber down on log slides. Each pole was roughly 20 feet long and 8 to 10 inches in diameter, heavy enough that two men could barely lift one. The contractors had to cut them, strip the bark, load them onto wagons or mule sleds, haul them to the construction route, and distribute them at intervals of 75 yards across 400 miles of terrain. It was a logging operation, a hauling operation, and a construction operation all at once, and it had to be done before winter closed the canyons. Not everything went smoothly. One of Young's sons attempted to back out of his contract, complaining that the pay was not sufficient for the labor. Brigham Young called the contractors together, reviewed the terms, and informed them that they would honor their agreements. The consequences of refusal, in a community where the church leader's word carried the weight of law, were clear enough. The poles arrived on schedule. It was one of the most consequential handshakes of the Civil War era, and almost nobody remembers it. If you have stayed with me this far, you understand that this is not a story about technology. This is a story about what 500 men did with their hands in the summer of 1861. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. We tell the ones that history forgot. Construction began on the 4th of July, 1861. Creighton's eastern crew dug the first post hole outside Omaha, while the rest of the country was watching fireworks and wondering whether the Union would survive the year. The crew was organized with military precision. First came the survey team, staking the route. Behind them came the hole diggers, working in pairs, one man swinging a long-handled shovel, the other prying rocks with an iron bar. Behind them came the pole setters, teams of 4 or 5 men who would lift a 20-foot pole upright, pack the base with earth and stone, and move on to the next hole. And behind the pole setters came the wire party. These were the men who climbed. Each pole had a wooden crossbar bolted near the top, and on that crossbar sat a glass insulator, a small dome of green or aqua glass about the size of a man's fist. The insulator was the critical piece. Without it, the electrical signal in the copper wire would bleed into the wet wood of the pole and die within a few miles. The glass kept the current in the wire. The wire party would uncoil copper wire from heavy spools, climb the pole, loop the wire through the insulator's groove, secure it, and move to the next pole. 3 to 8 miles a day. Every day. 16 hours of daylight in a Nebraska summer, and they used all of them. Think about that pace for a moment. 3 to 8 miles of finished telegraph line per day. That means the hole diggers alone were opening between 20 and 42 holes in the earth every single day. In clay, in sand, in rock. Without power tools. Without a gasoline engine. A shovel, an iron bar, a sledgehammer. The temperature on the Nebraska plains in July routinely exceeds 100 degrees. There was no shade. The water had to be hauled by wagon from the nearest creek, which might be 2 miles behind or 3 miles ahead. The men drank from barrels and ate salt pork and hardtack, and they did not stop. By mid-July, the Eastern crew had passed Fort Kearny, Nebraska, the jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail. The wire was live behind them, and commercial messages were already flowing. This was one of the project's ingenious features. As each section of line was completed, it became operational immediately. Revenue began the moment the first relay station opened. There was a station roughly every 50 miles, manned by a telegraph operator who could receive and transmit messages. These operators were young, usually in their 20s, and they lived alone in small wooden shacks on the open prairie, surrounded by nothing. The shack might be 12 feet by 12 feet with a single window, a cot, a table, a kerosene lamp, and the telegraph instrument. The instrument itself was simple: a brass key for sending, a sounder for receiving, a battery to power the signal. The operator would sit at the table for hours, listening to the clicks of the sounder, translating Morse code into words, writing them down on slips of paper for anyone who came to collect them. When the line was quiet, the shack was silent except for the wind outside and the occasional rattle of the door. When a message came through, the sounder would start clicking and the operator would reach for his pencil. It was lonely work. The nearest human being might be 50 miles in either direction. The operator's only companion was the clicking of the telegraph key and the hum of the wire in the wind. But the Eastern crew was not alone in its race. The Western crew, under James Gamble, had begun moving east from Carson City, Nevada, in late June. Gamble's obstacles were different from Creighton's, but no less brutal. The Sierra Nevada had to be crossed first, and the wagons carrying wire and insulators were so heavy that several broke down on the mountain passes. Then came the Nevada desert, alkaline flats where the ground was white with mineral deposits and the air shimmered with heat. Water was even scarcer than on the plains. Gamble wrote that in some sections, water had to be hauled in by teams from springs that were 20 or 30 miles from the construction line. The men drank warm, alkali-tainted water that left a chalky taste on the tongue and a burning in the gut. They kept working. One of the strangest problems Gamble faced was the same one that plagued Creighton: poles. Nevada is not a forested state. It is sagebrush and rock and sky. Where then do you find poles? Gamble contracted with local frontiersmen, men who knew the backcountry, who had discovered stands of timber in remote canyons during hunting expeditions. These contractors would cut the poles in the mountains, haul them by mule to the construction route, and distribute them at intervals. The logistics were staggering. Gamble wrote in his journal that at one point he could not conceive where the poles would come from. He could see nothing but treeless plain in every direction, even from the highest vantage point. But the frontier contractors knew their business. They always found the timber. They always delivered. The two crews had made an informal wager. Whoever reached Salt Lake City first would claim bragging rights and, presumably, a round of drinks. Creighton's Eastern crew had farther to go, roughly 1,100 miles from Fort Kearny to Salt Lake. Gamble's Western crew had about 600 miles from Carson City. But Creighton's route, while longer, was flatter. Gamble's route crossed the Sierra Nevada, the Nevada desert, and the rugged Wasatch Range before descending into the Salt Lake Valley. The race was not as uneven as the mileage suggested. By August, both crews were averaging roughly 200 miles of completed line per month. That number deserves a moment of silence. 200 miles of telegraph line per month. That means roughly 50 miles per week, roughly 8 miles per day on the good days. Each mile required approximately 13 poles, spaced 75 yards apart. Each pole required a hole in the earth, a crew to raise it, a crossbar, a glass insulator, and a length of wire strung and secured. Multiply that by 200, and you begin to understand the scale. In a single month, each crew was setting approximately 2,600 poles, digging 2,600 holes, and stringing 200 miles of wire, with hand tools, in heat that cracked lips and blistered skin. In country where the nearest doctor might be 100 miles behind, and there was no road to get back. The dangers were not dramatic in the way a battlefield is dramatic. There were no explosions, there were no collapsing tunnels, but the dangers were constant and grinding. Heat stroke took men off the line for days. Dehydration killed horses faster than it killed men. Rattlesnakes nested in the scrub grass where the hole diggers worked, and a bite in 1861, 100 miles from any settlement, was a death sentence or close to it. The wire itself was dangerous. Copper wire under tension, when it snapped, could whip with enough force to take off a finger or blind an eye. And the poles, 20 feet of timber being raised by hand, could fall sideways if the base was not packed tight, crushing whoever stood in the wrong place. There were also the Sioux. In the summer of 1861, the Sioux were watching the construction with growing unease. The wire was strange. The poles were strange. The men were strange. At one point, a party of Sioux warriors cut a section of completed line and took the wire to make bracelets. The story that followed became one of the Telegraph's first legends. Several of the warriors who wore the wire bracelets fell ill, and a Sioux medicine man declared that the spirit of the talking wire had cursed them. After that, according to the accounts, the Sioux left the line alone. Whether the story is entirely true or partly embellished by Telegraph Company publicists, the result was the same. The line moved forward. By September, Creighton's crew had crossed the Continental Divide and was descending into Utah. The Mormon contractors had done their work. Poles stood in long, straight lines through Echo Canyon and down toward the Salt Lake Valley. The wire party was moving fast now, stringing wire across terrain that had been prepared weeks in advance. Meanwhile, Gamble's crew had crossed the Nevada desert and was pushing into the Wasatch Range from the west. The two lines were converging. And then, something happened that should give you chills when you think about it. On the 18th of October, 1861, Creighton's eastern crew reached Salt Lake City. The last pole was set. The last wire was spliced. Edward Creighton personally made the final connection at Fort Bridger, joining the two segments of the Pacific Telegraph Company's portion of the line. A small crowd gathered in Salt Lake City, expecting to see the first message fly across the wire. They were briefly disappointed. For reasons the records do not fully explain, no through message was sent that day. But the line was live. The circuit was complete from Omaha to Salt Lake. 6 days later, on October 24th, the Overland Telegraph Company's western line from Carson City also reached Salt Lake City. The entire transcontinental circuit was complete. 2,000 miles of copper wire, 25,000 wooden poles, hundreds of glass insulators glinting in the autumn sunlight, relay stations every 50 miles, and 500 men who had done in 4 months what Abraham Lincoln had predicted might take 10 years. That evening, Stephen J. Field, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, sat down at a telegraph key in San Francisco and tapped out the first transcontinental message in American history. It was addressed to President Abraham Lincoln in Washington. The message assured Lincoln that the people of California desired to congratulate him on the completion of the great work, and that they believed the telegraph would strengthen the attachment binding both East and West to the Union. In the absence of the governor, Field wrote on behalf of the entire state. Lincoln, who had once been skeptical that the project could be done at all, received the message and responded. The president called the telegraph line auspicious for the stability and union of the republic. He now had something no commander-in-chief had ever possessed before: the ability to communicate in near real time with the western half of his country while fighting a war in the eastern half. Lincoln would come to depend on the telegraph in ways that no one anticipated. During the war, he spent long hours in the telegraph office at the War Department, reading dispatches from the front, sending orders to his generals, and sleeping on a cot beside the key when the news was bad. The telegraph did not just connect California to Washington, it connected the president to the battlefield. And it changed the nature of command. 2 days after Field's message, on October 26, 1861, the Pony Express officially ceased operations. The service had been running for only 18 months, carrying mail from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, in roughly 10 days. It was one of the most romantic enterprises in American history. Young riders on fast horses, galloping across the frontier, with leather mailbags. But the telegraph killed it in an afternoon. A message that took the Pony Express 10 days to deliver now took minutes. The Express was bankrupt within weeks. Its riders scattered. Its relay stations were abandoned. Some of those riders went to work for the telegraph companies, becoming operators and linemen. The frontier had a way of reusing its men. To understand how completely the telegraph changed the country, you have to understand what communication looked like before it. In 1841, when President William Henry Harrison died in office, it took 110 days for the news to reach Los Angeles. More than 3 months to learn that the president was dead. A letter sent by steamship from New York to San Francisco took 45 days. The fastest overland stagecoach from St. Louis to San Francisco took more than 20 days. The Pony Express, the fastest method available, could do it in 10 or 11 days if the weather cooperated. After October 24, 1861, the same message took minutes. Not days, not weeks, minutes. That is not a change. That is a collapse of distance itself. The West was no longer far away. It was right there, on the other end of a copper wire, and the country would never think about distance the same way again. You have been with me through half of this story now, and I appreciate that. If you are the kind of person who wants to know what happened to the men behind the wire, subscribe. There is more to this than the history books remember. But the completion of the line was not the end of the work. It was barely the beginning. A telegraph line is not a road. A road, once built, largely stays where you put it. A telegraph line is a living thing. It requires constant maintenance. Wind knocked down poles, storms broke the wire. Buffalo, those enormous herds that still roamed the Great Plains in 1861, used the poles as scratching posts. A 2,000-pound bull leaning against a 20-foot cottonwood pole could topple it in minutes. Workers had to ride the line constantly, repairing breaks, replacing poles, restringing wire. And there was the weather. The line was built in summer, but the first winter tested it brutally. Ice storms coated the wire with thick layers of frozen water, adding weight that the poles were never designed to bear. Entire sections sagged and snapped. In the mountains, avalanches buried poles under 20 feet of snow. On the plains, blizzards dropped visibility to zero, and the linemen who rode out to find the breaks did so in conditions that killed horses and men alike. The operators in their little shacks, isolated at 50-mile intervals across the wilderness, were sometimes snowed in for weeks. Their only connection to the world was the wire itself. When the wire went dead, they were truly alone. The cost of maintenance was enormous. Western Union poured money into keeping the line operational, and the revenue from message traffic barely covered it in the early years. The charge during the first week of operation was $1 per word, roughly $36 in today's money. That meant a 10-word message from San Francisco to New York cost the equivalent of $360. Only the wealthiest individuals and the most urgent government dispatches could afford the wire. But as the months passed and the line became more reliable, the rates dropped and the traffic increased. By the end of the Civil War, the Transcontinental Telegraph was generating substantial revenue, and Western Union was becoming one of the most profitable companies in America. The line also became a target. During the war, there were fears that Confederate sympathizers or hostile parties might cut the wire to isolate the West. In 1862, Lincoln requested that a Utah militia protect the line between Fort Bridger and Fort Laramie. Brigham Young organized a force of 90 men under Captain Lot Smith, a veteran of the Mormon Battalion, to patrol the route. The wire was that important. It was a strategic asset, a military lifeline, and everyone knew it. I want you to think about the men who built this line. Not Sibley in his office in Rochester, not Lincoln in the White House. The men on the ground. 500 of them, give or take. We do not have most of their names. The historical record is thin on the lives of individual workers. We know that Creighton hired Mormon immigrants for parts of the Eastern crew, men who were already traveling to Utah and were willing to work along the way. We know that Gamble hired local laborers in California and Nevada, men who were accustomed to hard work in desert heat. We know that several Native Americans were employed to drive and herd livestock during the construction. According to Gamble's own accounts, they were paid in provisions and clothing, not in cash. But the names of the hole diggers, the pole setters, the wiremen, the teamsters who drove the ox wagons loaded with spools of copper wire, the cooks who fed the crews, the water haulers who kept them alive, these names are almost entirely lost. They exist in fragments, a diary here, a ledger entry there. Charles Brown, a worker on the Eastern crew, kept a diary that was eventually rediscovered in the Smithsonian Institution's collections. It is the only known extensive day-by-day account of the construction from the perspective of an ordinary worker. Brown wrote about the heat, the dust, the monotony of digging, the satisfaction of watching the line stretch behind him toward the horizon. He wrote about bad food and short sleep, and the way the alkali dust got into everything, your eyes, your mouth, the creases of your hands. His diary is a window into a world that the official histories never bothered to record. We also know that Creighton's brother, whether it was John Andrew, Joseph, or James, the records are unclear, traveled to Florence, Nebraska, and attempted to recruit Mormon immigrants fresh off the boats from England. These men and women were already heading to Utah. Some of the men agreed to work on the telegraph line along the way, earning a few dollars to supplement what little they had. Imagine that. You have just crossed the Atlantic Ocean in steerage. You have traveled by rail and steamboat to the edge of the frontier. You speak with a Yorkshire accent or a Welsh one, and you have never held a shovel in the kind of heat that Nebraska delivers in August. And now a man is offering you a few dollars a day to dig holes in the earth and set wooden poles in them, from dawn to dark, across country you have never seen. Some of them said yes. Their names are in the church records somewhere, perhaps, or in a manifest that no one has read in 160 years. There is a grief in that. 500 men built a thing that changed the nation, and we cannot name most of them. They dug in the earth with iron tools. They climbed wooden poles in the heat. They strung wire across a continent, and when they were done, they scattered. Some stayed on as linemen and operators. Some went to fight in the war. Some went back to the farms and shops they had come from. A few died on the job, from heat stroke, from snake bite, from the simple accumulated violence of 16-hour days in brutal conditions. We do not know how many. The records do not say. What I can tell you is what it felt like. I've driven the route the line followed. Not the entire 2,000 miles, but long stretches of it through Nebraska and Wyoming and Nevada. The emptiness is the first thing you notice. Not emptiness in the modern sense, where there is always a cell tower on the horizon or a gas station at the next exit. Emptiness in the original sense. Nothing. Grass and sky and wind. In Nevada, not even grass. Just rock and sagebrush, and a silence so deep it rings in your ears. The air smells different out there. It smells like mineral dust and dry sage and heat rising off stone. In Nebraska in summer, it smells like baked earth and river mud and the faint sweetness of prairie grass baking in the sun. You stand out there and you try to imagine a crew of men in 1861 with no shade, no machinery, no communication except the line they were building, and you cannot quite do it. The scale defeats the imagination. You try to picture a man swinging a shovel for 16 hours under that sun, and then doing it again the next day, and the next, and the next, for 4 months, and the picture will not hold. It is too large, too relentless, too human. The poles are gone now, almost all of them. Cottonwood rots, pine weathers and falls. A few of the original glass insulators survive in museums. The Smithsonian has several. You can find them online too, in antique shops and private collections. They are small, beautiful objects, translucent green or aqua, shaped like a bell or a dome. They weigh a few ounces. Each one held the current that connected a president to his country during a civil war. Each one was carried on a wagon, hauled up a pole, and bolted to a crossbar by a man whose name we have forgotten. The Transcontinental Telegraph operated along its original route until 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The wire itself was galvanized iron of the best quality, according to the specifications. A single strand, strung on glass insulators, carrying a signal powered by wet cell batteries that delivered about 50 volts over distances of up to 500 miles between relay stations. The dry air of the western interior actually helped. Low humidity meant low signal leakage, which meant the current could travel farther before needing to be boosted at the next relay point. It was crude by any modern standard. A single wire, carrying a single signal at a time, tapped out letter by letter in Morse code, decoded by a human ear listening to clicks. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a revolution carried on a thread of metal thinner than a man's little finger. Once the railroad was finished, a new multi-wire telegraph system was built along the tracks, and the original line through the wilderness was gradually abandoned. Some sections were repurposed. Some were simply left to fall. The wooden poles decayed. The wire rusted. By the 1930s, the original line had been replaced entirely, first by the railroad telegraph and eventually by underground cable. I have stood where the two crews met, in Salt Lake City. The city has grown around the spot, of course. There is no monument that I could find to the exact location where the wires were joined. But the event itself is recorded in the journals and the newspapers of the day. The Deseret News reported it. Brigham Young sent a telegraph to the east, declaring that Utah had not seceded, that the territory was firm for the Constitution and the laws. It was more than posturing. For 14 years, the Mormons had been isolated in the desert, viewed with suspicion by the federal government, unable to communicate quickly with Washington. The telegraph changed that in a single evening. Young understood immediately what the wire meant. Within a few years, he began planning the Deseret Telegraph, a regional network connecting Mormon settlements across Utah and into Idaho. The first transcontinental line had shown him what was possible. Edward Creighton did not live to see the full legacy of what he built. He died in 1874, at the age of 54. His fortune, earned through telegraph construction and other ventures, endowed the university that bears his name. Creighton University in Omaha opened in 1878, 4 years after his death. It stands today as the most visible reminder of a man who once rode the entire route of the telegraph alone in winter, measuring the distance with his own eyes. James Gamble survived longer. He worked in the telegraph industry for 34 years and left behind a professional autobiography and family papers that are now held in archival collections. His daughter Mary wrote personal reminiscences of her father. Gamble died in 1905, having lived long enough to see the telephone, the automobile, and the beginnings of radio. He had been born in a world where the fastest message traveled at the speed of a horse. He died in a world where voices could cross oceans. Stephen J. Field, the man who sent the first transcontinental message, went on to serve on the United States Supreme Court for 34 years, one of the longest tenures in the court's history. His brother, Cyrus Field, had already attempted to lay the first transatlantic cable. The Field family understood, perhaps better than anyone, that wire was the future. And Hiram Sibley, the man who signed the contract and risked his fortune, he became the leader of the American telegraph industry. Western Union, the company he built through acquisition and consolidation, controlled 90% of the telegraph traffic in the United States by 1866. Sibley retired wealthy, invested in agriculture and seed companies, and died in 1888. He is buried in Rochester, New York, the city where he had once been sheriff. But here is what I keep thinking about. Not the executives, not the politicians, not the Supreme Court justices. The men with the shovels. In the summer of 1861, while the first major battle of the Civil War was being fought at Bull Run, 500 men in the West were digging holes in the earth and setting poles in them. They were not soldiers. They were not famous. They were laborers, most of them immigrants, most of them young. Most of them paid a few dollars a day in wages that would not buy a meal in a modern restaurant. They worked 16-hour days in heat that would send a modern construction crew to the hospital. They drank bad water. They ate worse food. They slept on the ground. And they built a thing that knitted a fractured nation together at the exact moment it was coming apart. The telegraph did not save the Union by itself, but it gave Lincoln something he desperately needed: speed. The ability to know, within minutes, what was happening 1,000 miles away. The ability to send orders and receive confirmation. The ability to hold the Western states close when distance and silence might have let them drift. Before the telegraph, a message from Washington to Sacramento took 3 weeks by stagecoach, longer in winter. After the telegraph, it took minutes. That compression of time changed the war. It changed the presidency. It changed the country. And it was done by 500 men with shovels and iron bars and spools of copper wire, working across 2,000 miles of wilderness in 4 months in the summer of 1861. You can still find traces if you know where to look. A few of the original glass insulators in the Smithsonian. A historical marker along the old route in Wyoming. Charles Brown's diary, rediscovered after more than a century, describing the day-to-day grind of construction. The name Creighton on a university in Omaha. The name Western Union on a building that once handled telegrams and now handles money transfers. The echoes are faint, but they are there. I want to leave you with one last image. It is October 24th, 1861. The sun is going down over Salt Lake City. The valley is gold and red with autumn light. A telegraph operator sits at a small table in a room on Main Street, his hand on a brass key. The wire stretches east over the Wasatch Range, over the Rockies, across the Great Plains, all the way to Washington. It stretches west over the desert, over the Sierra Nevada, to Sacramento and San Francisco. 2,000 miles of wire, 25,000 poles, 500 men's labor, 4 months of sweat and dust and blistered hands. The operator taps the key. The signal leaves Salt Lake City at the speed of electricity, 186,000 miles per second. It reaches Washington before the operator lifts his finger. The message says California is loyal. The message says the West is still part of the Union. The message says the wire holds. And somewhere out on the plains, the last of the construction crew is packing up tools and loading wagons. They will not be remembered by name. No monument will carry their faces. No textbook will list their contributions. But the wire they strung is humming above them in the evening wind, carrying the words of a president and a chief justice across a continent that, until 4 months ago, could not hear itself speak. If this story stays with you, subscribe to the channel. We are here to remember the ones the world forgot. The wire is gone now. The poles have fallen. But the work remains. It always remains.